Hey guys, welcome back to the Duke Wisdom Podcast. It's been a minute again. I know I say that and am often a broken record. I've got a lot. I've got a lot to talk about. I'm on a bit of a timer actually right now. I got dinner in the oven, so I got about 30 minutes almost on the dot to get this episode done. But I wanted to make sure I took the opportunity to one preview the Vermont game and a bit of the NCAA tournament, and then but two, and primarily to be able to talk about my experience at the ACC tournament, which is what I'm going to lead for and probably spend most of this episode talking about. The ACC tournament might not be something that Duke fans want to talk a whole lot about this year, because if you're talking about like a since 2010 and kind of modern memory even, very few times has Duke lost in the quarterfinal, and even fewer times has Duke lost its first game in the ACC tournament. Because like even the last time Duke lost in the quarterfinal game was in 2016, and that came against Notre Dame, but Duke wasn't a top 4 seed. They didn't have the double bye, so they'd actually won the game the day prior. So the last time they lost their first game in the ACC tournament, which was a quarterfinal game, was to Maryland in 2013. And when you look at all of the Duke teams that lost their first game of the ACC tournament, only like, since Coach K took over, only like 2 of them have made it past the first weekend. And that's kind of a scary thought, I think. And that 2013 team, you look at Maryland, they had Alex Len. I think if you're Duke in this situation, you felt a lot worse on Thursday night than you did on Saturday night. Because on Thursday night, you're like, man, just lost to NC State. Like, to State, really? A team that Duke had beaten just, 10 or so days earlier by 15. It handed State what is still its most lopsided loss of the entire season. But State was just on one, man. They were just on one. And it was it was really exciting to see that run from the Wolfpack. And I'll talk more about that. But I think in terms of the way I'm going to go about this is I'm just going to tell my experience from basically the moment I walked into Capital One Arena and what that looked like. So I got to go to the ACC tournament as an intern for the North Carolina Sports Network. I went with my boss and one of the lead content creator basically for the company, David Glenn. David was very gracious to bring me and pay for this trip, and so I got very lucky to have the opportunity to go to DC, stay in DC for a few nights and over the course of about half a week and cover this tournament. And I was in a more unique position, perhaps, than most at the ACC tournament, because most people there are very localized, very singular in their coverage. You have the DTH, the Daily Tar Heel, where I've worked before, who, the 3 people there that I know and said, hello to, that they're there to cover UNC. Then there's Inside Carolina, who's there to cover UNC. There's guys from 24/7 Sports who write for their independent team sites that are there for either Duke or for NC State, Virginia, go down the line. There are local reporters for like the Raleigh News and Observer. They're there probably to cover a single team, probably Carolina, maybe Duke, maybe State, maybe a little bit of 2 out of 3 of them or so. And then there's like Brendan Marks, who's really mostly worried about Carolina and Duke, but I think his job is expanded more at The Athletic, and he's a little more concerned about the national storylines, which NC State certainly turned into. But for me and for David and for the North Carolina Sports Network, we're particularly interested and the 19 Division I college basketball teams in North Carolina, 4 of which are Duke, Carolina State, and Wake Forest. But also, we're interested in the rest of the ACC. Our coverage includes the entire conference. And so for me, what was cool about this opportunity is I wasn't just coming in the door, Carolina, Florida State, and I had to, meticulously take notes. And then when the game ended, now I have to produce content for the North Carolina game. And because I'm busy creating content, I've now actually just missed the Pitt Wake game. I've potentially even, taken so long as to where I couldn't even do the Duke game. Or maybe I did Carolina, missed the Pitt Wake game, then watched Duke State, and then repeated that same content creation kind of cycle to where I then also couldn't watch Virginia Boston College. I wasn't in that position. Really, the position I was in was to find the most interesting storyline that day on the quarterfinal day. We didn't show up to the quarterfinals for, financial reasons. Also, the first 2 days are, not particularly the most interesting typically. But turns out the champion played during both of those days. But I got to just choose what I wanted to do, and I thought that was pretty cool. So, day one, the storyline to me was the bubble conversation. It's been a season-long debate within the ACC, and there were 2 teams playing that were right on the bubble or about to fall off the bubble, and that game was basically lose and you're done, win and you still got a shot at this, between Wake Forest and Pittsburgh. And so I was like, this is the story. And the way it played out, being Wake Forest losing, I got to the point where it's like, now this is 3 consecutive seasons that Wake Forest at the end of the year has basically fallen on its face and is just going to barely fall off the bubble, and they're going to be in the NIT, and it's going to happen 3 straight years with a transfer all ACC first team guard. I mean, how crazy is that the pattern just keeps going? And so that's what I chose to focus on for Thursday. Then on Friday, there's 2 games, and I didn't have to leave, after the first or whatever. And so the story that day was State. State had a absolutely miraculous end of that game that helped them beat Virginia, including a buzzer beater that happened more or less pretty much in front of me. So did the Boston College one. I mean, it was just a little bit of a diagonal slant for me, but I was very close. If you go back and look at those videos and look across press row, you can find me. And you can find my reaction to me putting like my hands on the top of my head and my jaw dropping when Michael O'Connell hits the shot against UVA, and a kind of similar reaction falling back in my chair the night before with the Boston College game. I had a blast, with people sending me pictures of me at the game or talking about seeing me on the TV. I thought that was a lot of fun. But, and I chose, the cardiac pack is back. That was the storyline for day 2. And obviously State beat was the storyline for day 3 as well. But it was a lot of fun, man, because also, and I'll talk about the championship more, and I'll talk about that aspect a little more actually as I go on.
Want to join a community of Duke accounts publishing news, theories, and predictions on Duke athletics? Join the Duke Wisdom Network. Just go to dukewisdom.org/join network today and fill out the form with your name and social media. Or you can DM at Duke_wisdom on Twitter or Instagram. Become a part of the community of Duke fans publishing their takes today. Again, that's dukewisdom.org/join network or DM at Duke_wisdom on Twitter or Instagram.
Let's start day 1. We left in the morning, which was different than a lot of people who were probably there for media availability the day prior. Again, because they're so, zeroed in on one school, they want to be there for everything that school does. It's less important for us to do that. So we came and we got, we were really pressed time-wise, getting into DC, checking into our hotel, and then getting everything together, getting our credentials, meal vouchers once we enter Capital One Arena, that kind of thing. So we get in Capital One, we took a taxi there, and because we hadn't figured out the media shuttle or whatever yet, but we get to Capital One, we walk in, do all the security processing, go down the tunnel, and we didn't go around kind of the tunnel the way we should have because we didn't really know where our seats were. So we're scooching past everybody on press row, Tyler Zeller and whatnot. And David stops and he starts talking to this guy. I'm like, why did we stop? And I look up and I'm like, holy crap, that's Roy Williams. And so, perhaps not the most famous or popular man among listeners to this podcast, but a very, very cool meeting with a Hall of Famer and a legend for me. It was a very brief meeting, but it was one where it was before I was even introduced to Roy Williams that he had already reached his hand out to introduce himself to me, and learn my name, that kind of thing. And so that was beyond cool to get to do that. I mean, literally within 5 minutes of walking into Capital One Arena, the very first person I met was Roy Williams, which is just kind of crazy. Besides, the arena personnel and everybody checking me in. But we find our seats. Meal vouchers were great, man. There's some pretty good food in Capital One Arena. I'm not going to lie. You ever go to a Wizards game? Which, by the way, another fun fact that NC State won more games in Capital One Arena in 5 days than the Wizards have all season, which is really sad. That's a really sad fact. But if you ever find yourself at a Wizards game or just in Capital One for any old reason, there's like a barbecue kind of stand thing. Some solid barbecue there. Also chicken sandwiches, some chicken tenders, man. The fries are seasoned really well. So some good food in there. I won't lie. Expensive, obviously. No doubt expensive. But first game was Carolina, Florida State. That one went pretty much as planned. And then Pitt was blowing Wake out by a lot more than anticipated in the second game, but Wake brought it close. Pitt still got the win. Third game is the one I was really looking forward to. And so the very first thing I noticed was, McCain he was out there warming up at first. I was actually on my press row seat sitting next to Mike Schrage, and I talked to him briefly for a second. I didn't want to take too much of his time because, he's working, doing stuff pregame. I talked to Schrage for a second, and then I notice eventually I see Jared McCain come back onto the court with a bandage over his eye, and I see Jared's brother on the floor, and he's kind of signaling to somebody behind me, and I see that it's Jared's mother, and he tells her that, Jared's had stitches, basically. They bring the conversation in a little bit. I can't hear it anymore. Obviously, it's found out after I reported that McCain had the bandage and the stitches, everything on broadcast. ESPN talked about the collision with Jalen Blakes that happened in shoot around. A very unfortunate event to happen. I was fortunate, I guess, to be the first one to report that, but it was tough because it very clearly impacted Jared McCain's game, and he just wasn't shooting particularly well, and it was a bad thing to happen right before the game. And that was tough for him. And I don't know exactly what's going on with Jeremy Roach, but, he had Jose over there working on him a little bit before the game, trying to loosen him up. I suspect that Roach has been dealing with some smaller injuries for most of this season, just like he did last year. And it's been tough for him to adjust to that. But I think what we've seen in the last 2 games now from Jeremy Roach, both in that Carolina game and on senior night, and now the state game, is Roach has not looked like himself. He's the face of dependability for this Duke team, and he is the leader of this Duke team. And so when he doesn't show, it's really difficult for them to win games, but it's especially difficult when he didn't show against State, and neither did Jared McCain. How much of that is due to the eye cut or whatever, I don't know, but he didn't play well, and neither really did Tyrese Proctor. So you've got all 3 of these guards that were basically no-shows, and the bench just isn't a factor. Caleb Foster's just not going to play, I don't think, the rest of the season. And he certainly was not playing at the ACC tournament. He was there. I can say Christian Reeves and Jaden Shute were not there. They did not travel with the team. But the rest of the bench, it's like Power just wasn't bringing anything. despite the fact that he had probably his best game as a Blue Devil in PNC Arena, Sean Stewart was not up to round 2 against State. He didn't really bring anything. Blakes didn't play much, and in the minutes he did, he didn't really bring anything. Ryan Young didn't really bring anything. And so it was like you got nothing, absolutely nothing from the bench. Backcourt gave you probably its worst game of the entire season as an accumulative effort. So it was really just Mark Mitchell and Kyle Filipowski fighting this battle. And Kyle had one of his best games of the season, best games of his career at Duke, 28-14. And I still saw a lot of Duke fans, getting mad, blaming Kyle. And I've mentioned this, that I think the hate for Filipowski is just crazy. And it's like Duke fans don't back him in the same way that they've backed players perceived as villains in the past. And I think that's really frustrating, right? The whole trip with Harrison Ingram thing was something that I think was telling amongst the Duke faithful, kind of the way that they viewed Filipowski. Obviously, we knew there was going to be this level of vitriol from Carolina and from other fan bases that Filipowski had tripped Harrison Ingram. But for Duke fans themselves to be like, this is unacceptable, he has to be suspended, not even attempting to defend it, was surprising, because they have defended other players for worse. And so I don't understand, and I don't understand that he doesn't have the heart, or that he's selfish comments. For many reasons, those are very much untrue. And I just wish that we would maybe deal with that a little bit differently. But Filipowski played very well against NC State. And Mitchell had a really good game overall. He struggled from the line, especially those two at the end that really could have made it a different game. Duke had a chance when there was that sort of missed dunk and that technical foul. They had, it felt like there was some sort of momentum shift at that point, but it fell out of their hands. And Duke has now played 9 games decided by 5 or less, and 7 of them have resulted in a loss. And the 2 that were wins were that Clemson one that they just barely took away, and the second meeting with Georgia Tech, the one in Cameron, they took by 5 points. So it's been tough for Duke in close games, which is not really a great sign heading into the NCAA tournament. Like, Duke needs to hope that they can beat Vermont soundly in the first round, and they have to hope that they can beat James Madison or Wisconsin soundly in the second round if that matchup happens. Then the thought of, if they were to make it to the Sweet 16 and Houston were to as well, can Duke soundly beat Houston? Because I don't know if they can close a close game against them. They really haven't proved that that's something they can routinely do, especially against a team of that quality. So that's a concern. Depth is a concern that I think was really exposed against State. And we'll just see. It's March and you never know, but things don't look great at the moment for Duke. You have to try to remain a little bit optimistic, but at the moment, it's just not looking great. I guess for once, Duke doesn't have the expectation that amongst itself, obviously, it has the expectation to be a Final Four team. Everybody, the guys in the locker room, that's their expectation. It might even be the expectation of some Duke fans. But I think for many other Duke fans and for opposing fan bases, they're not really expecting Duke to go to the Final Four. And I think there might be some benefit to that, because a lot of the Duke teams that are projected to go to the Final Four popularly don't, especially lately. And I think that there were not a lot of people who saw 2010 as a national championship team, but it turned into it. Duke doesn't have a lot of luck with turning 4 through 8 seeds into Final Fours, like some other blue bloods have had success in those departments in certain years. Duke doesn't really do that. You kind of typically know what you're getting from Duke in the NCAA tournament based on what seed they are. Like, they can certainly undershoot your expectations, but seldom does Duke overshoot your expectations. You set your expectations beforehand, and if your expectations for this Duke team is a Sweet 16, that's what their seed would project. And I think that's a reasonable expectation for this team. And I think that they are most likely to meet that expectation and go to the Sweet 16 and then get eliminated by Houston. I think that's the most likely outcome. I think it is then the next likelihood is that they actually undershoot that expectation. I think in years past, that's kind of what we've seen. Just looking at there's a few teams though that have overshot, but they don't overshoot by much. They don't overshoot from this is supposed to be a Sweet 16 team and they just made it to the championship game. That doesn't often happen, especially for Duke though. And I think 2022 might have overshot by a round, maybe, to what the expectation was for them, or maybe 2. But often, last year's team, people thought could be a Final Four team, and they fell very much shy of that. But by seed, they got out when they were supposed to. And then 2019, that was a championship team. A lot of people believed it, but they fell short of even the Final Four. 2018 was a Final Four team, I think. Fell short of that. Although by seed, they made it exactly where they were supposed to go. 2017, definitely undershot expectations. 16 probably met those expectations, but didn't exceed them. 15, I would say, exceeded them. I mean, they weren't the favorite to be the champion, but they were, a team that was in the mix for the Final Four. There's zero doubt about that. And, 14 definitely undershot. I think 13 met sort of its expectations, but really there was a consensus that could have been a Final Four team as well. Obviously 12 undershot and keep going down the line. But that's just kind of what I've experienced. And I guess the hope is that maybe the lack of attention on this Duke team is a bit odd. It's not common for a Duke team to have this little attention on it coming into the NCAA tournament. Maybe that will benefit them. Maybe that will prove that they'll go in and just try to be like, look, this is still Duke. This is still a Final Four team. And maybe they'll do that. I think there's a chance, obviously. So that's kind of where I fall in the NCAA discussion. And I think that Duke has a favorable matchup against Vermont, in which Vermont doesn't have a lot of size. Duke should be able to really take advantage of that with Filipowski, especially, but also Mark Mitchell to an extent, and be able to. But they're going to have to make their threes. This Duke team is very dependent upon its ability to make 3-pointers, and that's kind of where things really went awry against State, is they just couldn't hit threes. And when you can't hit threes, this Duke team's built around the process of hitting threes. They just couldn't do that. So, Duke was a little late getting into the press conference after that loss to State, and it was a depressing scene in the locker room. Everybody had left but McCain, Proctor, Mitchell, and Filipowski. Not even Jeremy Roach was still around. And, we mostly talked to Flip, and there's nothing else for those guys to do but look forward to the next step. But for me, it was a little sad. I'm there in the capacity as a journalist. I'm not rooting for anybody, but I cover Duke here for Duke Wisdom, and Duke's probably it is where my main focus is. There's no doubt about that. And so I wanted to see Duke play for more than a day. But, day 2 comes around, Carolina plays Pitt. It's honestly a pretty decent game for a while, but Carolina takes it, probably knocks. And ultimately, now in retrospect, we know did end Pitt season. And then the second game was between State and Virginia. And I kind of, in my head, because most of these games weren't going exactly how I would have wanted them to go. And so I got to see, UVA have quite the advantage over NC State for most of that game. And at the end, it really looked like it was Virginia's game to lose. I mean, in the second half, Isaac McNeely was a man possessed. He was just nailing every shot. But they had overtime the day prior against Boston College. Was a game where Boston College looked like they were going to win for most of the night. But then comes into overtime, Virginia stifles them and they get the win. And Virginia was literally 11-0 after that in those games. And so it's interesting. Think that that could just end. That could just end, basically. And it did. I could not believe when Michael O'Connell made that shot. And when he did make that shot, I was just, it clicked in my head. I was like, this State team's just sort of ordained for victory. They're going to win. they're going to win this game. And the next day, so my girlfriend goes to NC State, and she decided to actually drive up with some family friends. They drove up and made it like right before the game to DC, and she's there up in the upper level. And I met up with her right before the game, and I was just like, it's so crazy that you're here, but also like taper your expectations. Every bit of logic tells me that Carolina is going to win this game because Carolina's a legitimate national championship contending team this year. They're really good. I said, but State's just kind of like on their bullcrap right now. Like they're just, I don't know if there's a single team that could beat NC State tonight in the country. Quite honestly, the moxie that they had, I don't know, man. It was just like DJ Horn was on one that night. Muhammad Diarra has been that guy. DJ Burns, come on, man. DJ Burns. I voted DJ Burns MVP 100% in the all tournament team. Easy vote. And Michael O'Connell was fantastic. And I would have never guessed when I first got into DC that I'd be watching State win. But I think it was a really fun moment. And it's a very historically significant moment to see the first 5 in 5 days in ACC tournament history. I think that was really fun to see. Really cool to see. And while everybody else is kind of funneling back into the tunnel to try to be present for Hubert Davis and the Carolina press conference because they're covering Carolina, I didn't really have to worry about that. I had gone to every other press conference almost, but I didn't go to that one. I just took it in. I just looked up and watched as the confetti fell on me. And then I went down on the court and I watched State cut the net, and I watched a man who probably thought he was going to get fired on Tuesday if they lost to Louisville. They were down at the half to Louisville, by the way. And then 5 days later, he's got an automatic 2-year extension. And he's just whipping that net around, man. Smile on that guy's face. I mean, he walked into the press conference, I think, after beating Duke or Virginia, and he's just looked at us and he's just like, don't act surprised. And like gave us a big old smile. Kevin Keats, man, he's a funny guy. But it's crazy. It's just such a crazy story. And it's like State's always in the middle of things like that. And it wasn't an easy run. They had to beat the top 3 seeds, and they had to beat the 5 other schools in the ACC that have national titles to win. And it was the most NC State thing ever, right? Like, I don't think any other school could have pulled that off but NC State. But Duke didn't win. Duke was only there for a day, but it was just a magical week to get to see that team win. You know, like, that's to get to say that I was at that one. Like, there's certain ACC tournaments that are like cool for a certain reason, but they're not like terribly historically significant. But that one, everybody is going to know about that one for a long time. And I think it's really cool, and I'm so thankful to have gotten the opportunity to have been there and covered it and experienced that championship in such an intimate way, and to be so close to the action. That was just spectacular, and I consider myself very lucky having had that experience. If you guys have any other questions of me, you know, make sure you tweet them at me and whatnot. I'm getting to the end of my time for this one, but, you know, thanks for listening. I know it's, you know, a little bit removed from the ACC tournament now, so everybody's gaze is firmly on Duke's game on Friday night, which I will certainly be talking about on here after that game happens. Thanks so much for listening. As always, tuning in. Make sure to follow Duke Wisdom on Instagram and Twitter. Follow my personal Twitter account at BenMCC33 for my coverage with the NC Sports Network. And thanks so much for listening, guys, and I'll talk to you later.